I'm David Walsh. I'm the editor of the History News Network, and I'm speaking this morning with Manisha Sinha, professor of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She was just a guest on The Daily Show on Wednesday, was it?
Tuesday.
Tuesday. I watched them a day. I watched them the morning afterwards.
Mhm.
Uh, to discuss some claims that Judge Andrew Napolitano had made about Abraham Lincoln on his Fox News program. And Napolitano was invited as a guest on The Daily Show. So thank you, Professor, for joining us this morning. Um, so what I wanted to talk about initially, at least, is the sort of school of thought where Andrew Napolitano comes from. He's a libertarian. He's written several books about American history, Dred Scott's Revenge, A Legal History of Race and Freedom in America, where he presents a libertarian argument about various racial laws in U.S. history. Theodore and Woodrow, How Two American Presidents Destroyed Constitutional Freedom. That thesis is right in the title there. And he made the argument both on his Fox News program and on The Daily Show that the Civil War was Abraham Lincoln's war, that it was unnecessary, that slavery was neither really the true cause of it, nor was it necessary to go to war to abolish slavery and end the institution. Where does this argument come from? Because Napolitano is not the only one making it. There are scholars out there who have made similar arguments. Thomas DiLorenzo, for example. Politicians. We were just discussing this before beginning recording. So, can you sort of outline the school of thought?
That's a good question, David. I think the roots of this interpretation lie in the sort of revisionist views of the Civil War that were quite common at the turn of the century, even amongst scholars and mainstream academics. De Lorenzo and all are not they're sort of academic, but they're not really mainstream historians, and they don't really know all their facts. But this view that the Civil War was a needless war, and that slavery was just a pretext, that was not really the cause of the war, that it was a war of northern aggression against, a defensive slave South. That was pretty much entrenched in Civil War historiography right down to, the Second World War, which made racism unfashionable and made people think a little bit about slavery. A lot of historians at that point started going back to the records, going back to contemporaries who in fact argue that slavery was the cause. And if you look at all the documents from that time period, including documents written by Southerners who are unapologetic about the fact that they're going to war in order to protect and defend slavery. There is a school of historians that try to sort of undermine the importance of slavery, neo-revisionists we call them, who say it was really the breakdown in the political system that was more important, that, quote, most Northerners were racist and therefore not concerned about slavery, that except for a minority of abolitionists, slavery could not have been the motivating factor. That is, I would say, a minority opinion in Civil War historiography today. Most historians actually are quite convinced that slavery was indeed the cause. And the reason why I think this has sort of come about, has become popular in political circles and amongst neo-Confederate libertarians is because it serves their political argument well. They do not know much history. They constantly make mistakes with their facts, as Judge Napolitano did, called the Buchanan Tariff the 1859 tariff. It was actually passed in 1857, and it was one of the lowest tariffs ever in the 19th century. Or the fact that he forgot that the Morrill Tariff Act of 1861 was passed after many of the lower South states had actually seceded from the Union. So those, elementary factual errors, besides that, they will take isolated facts and sort of make that into or make that the basis of an argument. And it's very easy to debunk some of the ideas, including, ideas on Civil War mortality and how that matches up to the destruction of slavery, etc.
Speaking of facts, there was one fact that he seemed rather insistent upon. Lincoln enforced the Fugitive Slave Act. He repeated that argument several times.
Yeah.
It's not one that I'm familiar with. My assumption
Right.
is that and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. My assumption, as somebody with an historical background, is that he's referring to some isolated instances where slaves were returned to former masters in the border states to ensure their loyalty.
Right. Right. I mean, firstly,
And is that even true?
yeah, that statement it was factually incorrect, and all of us said that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is not correct. And as usual, any such fact, it was an exaggeration, or even I would say a sort of a misconception of certain other facts. Right. We know that Lincoln was very close to Ward Lamont, who was a close friend and ally of his, who was the sort of marshal in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C., and he was very eager to return fugitive slaves. There were instances when it was not clear what the policy of the federal government was in regard to enforcing the federal fugitive slave law, which was, after all, still in the books, that there were people who sympathized or who were pro-slavery, who had no anti-slavery sympathies at all, whether they were, local Union Army military commanders or local state authorities who were still enforcing the laws of slavery. The status of slavery in the beginning of the Civil War was not really determined. But to say that Lincoln personally sent federal marshals to enforce the law the way Franklin Pierce did, or the way some of the Northern Doughface presidents did, was simply untrue. And he had to be called out on that. And when indeed Congress got a chance to act on this, they sent instructions very early on in the war to Union Army field commanders that indeed they should not enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. So the Lincoln administration and Congress made it clear very early in the war that the Fugitive Slave Act would, be a dead letter. And so all his facts were wrong. And again, history is far more complicated, as my complicated answer suggests to you, right?
Right.
You really have to dig deep and figure out what exactly was happening on the ground. So there, as I said, there was some. He knew vaguely about some of those early returns. He probably had read about Ward Lamont, but he completely used that to exaggerate and, in fact, utter something that is totally incorrect.
Let's take a step back from those specific factual arguments and sort of look at the broader picture. In 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected and the Republican Party took control of Congress, what was the goal of the Republican Party? What was the goal of the Lincoln administration? I mean, Napolitano argued that it was to end slavery at any cost immediately, and hence the Civil War. At least that was the implication. Is that really the case? What was their platform? What was their slavery policy?
Yeah, I felt like laughing that he portrayed Lincoln as this kind of extreme anti-slavery abolitionist tyrant. Because if you actually look at the historical record, the Republican Party was elected on the platform of the non-extension of slavery into the Western territories. It was not elected on a platform of abolition, right? And that was as far as Lincoln was willing to go when he was elected. And to Lincoln's credit, he was not willing to repudiate that platform, because he was asked to do so in order to prevent secession, to repudiate the platform of the Republican Party, the non-extension of slavery, even though he was willing to guarantee slavery as it existed in the southern states and even implement the fugitive slave law. He said he was willing to let slavery be the way it was under the Constitution, but that the federal government would indeed implement the non-extension of slavery into the West. Now, Lincoln, of course, evolves from that position in the course of the war. By 1862 summer, he is in fact embarking on a policy of emancipation. He's thinking about it. So he moves from non-extension to abolition in the middle of the war, and by the end of the war, he's even contemplating limited suffrage and citizenship rights for African American men. So in this sense, Lincoln comes to abolitionist ground, but it is fairly late in the war. It is the revolutionary situation of the war itself, the actions of the slaves fleeing to Union Army lines, the pressure he gets from his own party, from radical Republicans and abolitionists, that moves him to take higher anti-slavery ground. This idea that he was set on abolition when he began the war is not necessarily correct. It might describe the opinions of radical Republicans. I don't think it describes the opinions of moderates and conservatives in the party. Of course, I should tell you that Jim Oakes, in his new book, Freedom National,
Excellent.
argues that, in fact, getting rid of slavery was an idea that all Republicans shared. And clearly, all Republicans felt that by preventing the extension of slavery, they would put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. I don't think that they were all sort of immediate abolitionists, at least not the way Judge Napolitano portrays them to be.
Well, in essence, though, what you're saying is that Judge Napolitano's prescribed course, which is the gradual extinction of slavery, was the platform of the Republican Party in 1860, and by preventing it from expanding, the goal was presumably something similar to the situation in Brazil, where in 1888 slaves were eventually emancipated. So, since that was the actual platform of the Republican Party in 1860 that they were elected upon, what would have prevented secession? And a two-part question: was war inevitable after secession?
Again, very good questions. Lincoln's position on this and the Republican Party position on this was non-extension of slavery, and Southern slaveholders viewed it exactly the way Judge Napolitano does. They thought this means the end of slavery. Their position was the perpetuity and the extension of slavery in the American Republic, otherwise we are seceding. The South seceded because of the results of a Democratic presidential election. They refused to act, or I should say the lower South states seceded because they did not want to accept the results of a presidential election when they lost control of the federal government. And they did not completely lose control of it, but they certainly lost control of the presidency.
Yeah,
and in Congress, in the House of Representatives, the Republicans were in power, right? Yeah, right. So they saw the handwriting.
Just to make it clear, cross purposes, just to make it clear, prior to 1860, Southern Democrats dominated the federal government at almost every level, correct?
Absolutely. And you had Northern dough-faced presidents, Northern men with Southern principles, who basically bowed to Buchanan, Pierce, and before that, Fillmore. So, they all bowed to Southern slaveholders' demands that this is the price of union. You leave slavery alone. But Southerners were not content. If you look at the 1850s, you go from the fugitive slave law to Kansas, Nebraska, the repeal of the Missouri Compromise line, the spread of slavery in the Northwest. Then you go to Dred Scott decision. So when Northerners felt that Southern slaveholders were dominating national politics, they were actually reading what was happening quite accurately, because that was indeed happening in the 1850s. And the fact that a third party is formed and is so quickly successful, one of the few instances in American history that this has happened, shows the amount of concern there was in the North over this question. Not every Northerner was an abolitionist, but they had been won over to the anti-slavery position of non-extension. And the majority that elected Lincoln in 1860 shared these convictions because they had other options. They could have voted for the two Democratic candidates, or they could have voted for the Constitutional Union Party that was just for the preservation of the Union. So the South seceded because they refused to accept a loss of power, and they refused to accept the election of a democratically elected president. So to call this a war of northern aggression is laughable. Who is initiating the actual divide at this point is worth recalling. Also, in April, when the Confederacy shot the first war, the Civil War, took place on Fort Sumter, that is when the four Upper South states that had not seceded, when they were forced to choose between North and South, went with the Confederacy. So both in terms of not accepting the results of an election and in terms of actually firing the first shot of the Civil War, it came from the southern states. So to hold Lincoln responsible, as Judge Napolitano and his fellow libertarians do, is somewhat laughable.
Well,
who's the aggressor here? I'm trying to argue.
Isn't the argument, though, that because Lincoln maneuvered the South in firing the shots at Fort Sumter by sending in a resupply ship and then calling for volunteers to put down the insurrection, That's the basis of that argument, that Lincoln started the
Yes,
Civil
it's
War.
a very old argument put forward by neo-Confederates like Ludwell Johnson. I love that name. I love to say it. Ludwell Johnson. In the 1920s or 30s,
That is the kind of name
shot
you'd
the
expect from a
first,
guy in the 20s.
who shot the first, and I've argued this in my first book, The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, where I took apart this argument that Judge Napolitano repeated. And I love the fact that John Stewart sort of skewered him. Lincoln tricked the South into firing the first shot. I think it's hilarious. Yes, Lincoln did send in reinforcements. And in fact, even before that firing, the Confederacy had already sort of acted belligerent when Lincoln tried to reinforce. But I read the papers of the South Carolina Secession Convention and the government and the correspondence between the South Carolina state government and Confederate officials over Fort Sumter, the leaving of Fort Moultrie, and the fact that the Federals were sort of holding at Fort Sumter. It was quite clear that they wanted to fire the first shot, that they wanted to create a warlike situation that would force the Upper South to choose. And they had been saying this for many years, as I have said in my book, which I think few people read. But I sort of suspected that John Stewart had actually read it because he was able to sort of respond to Napolitano, not just in this show, but in a previous show where he really skewered Napolitano's views extremely well. I feel that, he may have read some version of this. So this notion that Lincoln tricked people is based on a lack of historical knowledge, based on assumptions. And if you're a good historian, go to the sources. Go read what is happening in terms of the correspondence. Go read, what the Lincoln administration is saying at that point. They're actually trying to avoid a full shooting war. Lincoln is in trouble. He's surrounded by border slave states. The capital is. And slavery is legal in Washington, D.C. So the idea that Lincoln would purposely create, and especially a man of Lincoln's temperament, who sort of, to a fault virtually, ranged towards moderation and compromise, is just simply nonsense, in my opinion.
See, it also raises the interesting question, and it's a legal question that countries face today. Ukraine, most prominently right now, it's when you have a breakaway region of a country, what happens to federal property there? What are the legal implications of those states seizing federal property? That was the issue behind Fort Sumter.
There's a whole debate about secession and when is secession legitimate? When is breaking away illegitimate? When is it a democratic revolution? And when is it, in fact, a sort of a coup to take over a region? And people forget that the South was not just inhabited by secessionists. There were 4 million slaves there, excuse me? They were human beings. And I don't think they all voted for secession. There were Southern Unionists there. The way the secession elections were conducted in the South was not exactly democratic. Even what is happening in Crimea today, in Ukraine, we know that a lot of people, like the Tatars, etc., simply do not want to vote in this election. So how do you figure out what is a legitimate vote? What represents popular majority opinion in a certain region? For a state, for instance, like South Carolina or Mississippi, they were black majority states. You want to have a vote? Sure. Let's include all adult males there, in my opinion, women too, who would, of course, do not have the right to vote then. So the idea that secession was somehow this democratic local movement is also something that I have argued strongly against in my first book, The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, where I have shown how slaveholders used every trick in the book to dominate politics and managed to convince a majority of non-slaveholding whites in the South that indeed secession was the solution. There were instances where votes for secession in the South did not have a competing ballot. In South Carolina, that was true for most regions. So what is the choice there that people are given? I found instances of immense intimidation, even in South Carolina, which was a predominantly slaveholding area. Even there, they use all kinds of tactics in order to show that, that the election went the secessionist way. So to see these as democratic movements is problematic. I see them as movements to protect and defend slavery, to protect human bondage, which just happens to be one of the most undemocratic institutions ever invented in human history. So yes, that would be my answer.
So it's also somewhat it would be a stretch. It would be a stretch to say, for me at least, shocking, because I've heard these arguments before, um, Judge Napolitano's arguments. But I think for the general public, I mean, 12 Years a Slave just won the Best Picture Oscar. It's been a tremendously successful movie. It has, and you just wrote an op-ed about this in the New York Daily News last week. I mean, it's been a cultural touchstone. I mean, it's really sort of, and you could have made the argument in the 80s about Roots, or even Django Unchained a few years ago in the sort of Quentin Tarantino comic book version of Slavery and Revenge. But, I mean, it seems like the institution of slavery has become more central to American public memory, at least white American public memory, than it has been in quite a long time. So to hear these arguments then, it's just a little bit jarring that
Right.
That they can still exist in this moment. That because Napolitano, the implicit underpinning of his arguments, and in the extended interview with Stewart, which is online, he draws some comparisons to the Revolutionary War. But there seems to be this valuing of economics and of an orderly economic system above human bondage and human liberation. So where does, I mean, can you comment on that at all?
That's an excellent question. I think the reason why these movies that have looked at slavery and emancipation, and I would include Spielberg's Lincoln in this, it's because, we do have an African American president. I think it has opened up, at least in popular culture, conversations about race and slavery that did not occur before. I did not expect, for instance, 12 Years a Slave to ever become a movie. I have been teaching it for 10 years, and suddenly it's a movie, and I can tell my undergraduate students, go see the movie, because it's not such a bad representation of what was actually in the narrative. A lot of this has been dismissed as neo-abolitionist stuff. That why should we even think about the suffering of Black people? This is all like neo-abolitionists, or the abolitionists did this, and that it was not important. And I think that is ridiculous to see it in that way, precisely because it is done by people who just cannot imagine African Americans as equal fellow citizens of the American Republic. And we know that. There's a tremendous backlash also at the same time to the election of Obama, to portray him as an alien, as not really American. And part of it is going back to the era of slavery, where most Americans valued the Union and Constitution and what you call, and quote, orderly economic and political order over the freedom of Black people. Abolitionists did not. And they were eventually able to show to most American citizens, at least in the North, that slavery posed a danger not just to Black freedom, but to their liberties too. That it would undermine the norms of democratic governance in this country too. And they were effective in doing that. But to say that slavery is just like this issue about Black freedom and Black slavery without any economic valence is also ridiculous, as Eric put it quite well in his answer. Slavery as an economic asset in the United States was more valuable than all other economic assets in this country, save the land itself, right? So we are talking about a huge investment of property. The value of slave-grown cotton labor was more than the value of any other item of export from the United States before the Civil War. The value of slave-grown cotton was immense. It was the most valuable commodity from the United States. So it was central, not just to Southern regional economy, but to the national economy. There are some historians right now who are kind of going overboard with this thesis. Slavery itself becomes capitalism, but it is quite clear that slavery played a central role in propping up capitalism, that the slave-grown cotton labor was being used in Lowell mills, the first places to sort of introduce a factory system in New England. So to say that this was some kind of aberrant Southern institution that, quote, some sort of, the natural progress of liberty in American history would eventually get rid of is ridiculous. Again, to quote Eric, it's ridiculous because slavery had not faded away as the Founding Fathers had fondly hoped. It had grown and expanded in the American Republic. It was becoming more and more entrenched. It was protected by certain clauses in the Constitution. It was entrenched in the national economy. Southern slaveholders had a very powerful position in national government and did not fail to exercise their power. So this notion that slavery was, being protected because, people just didn't want to go against law and order. No, it was in their interests. And it was in the national interest, in fact, one could argue, to kind of protect the institution of slavery, that you needed a revolutionary situation like the Civil War for people to really get rid of it, that you needed the US Constitution to be remade with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to finally get rid of the vestiges of slavery and those unseemly compromises over slavery that was made in the Constitutional Convention. And I would have loved to say this to Judge Napolitano, and I didn't get a chance to. He kept talking about, 780,000. I think it was more around 750. Kind of added a few thousands there, as they always do. They lose it with their facts. Americans died in the American Civil War. I would have liked to point out that there were 4 million slaves living in slavery, which was nothing if not a state of war against them and their posterity. And I would have liked to point out to him that when the American Republic was founded, there were around 750,000 African Americans in this country, of which nearly 90% were enslaved. That's nearly the same amount of people who died in the Civil War. Who's to be blamed for that result? Judge Napolitano really needs to think about these arguments. So do the libertarians. And I think it is their essential failure to look at African Americans as equal citizens that makes them make these ridiculous arguments.
Well, thank you, Professor, so much for speaking with me today, and it's been a real pleasure, and it's been very educational.
Thank you, David, for having me and for allowing me to say all the things I wanted to say at the Daily Show.
Well, you're more than welcome.